Hello and welcome viewers and subscribers of AVT News. My name is Olisi, the son of Nobe, and I thought after a few days out, I had to come and address you again, as we had promised that every week we're going to be having uh, these live shows in which we will be talking to you, especially about the political situation, about the social situation, about everything that is happening around Africa, a number of different African countries. So today, uh, I decided that we need to talk about a very topical issue on the sanctions against Zimbabwe. You'll know that there's been a debate on whether or not Zimbabwe is indeed under sanctions. The second debate has been uh, if Zimbabwe is indeed under sanctions, should the sanctions be lifted? And the other question has been, do the sanctions affect the ordinary people of Zimbabwe, or they affect a select few among Zimbabweans? So this is what I want. This is what I want us to talk about, because I see the debate has been going on for quite some time, with many people arguing first that Zimbabwe is not under sanctions. There are also others who are arguing that the sanctions are targeted at individuals. There are many who are saying that, on the contrary, the sanctions are targeting Zimbabwe as a country. So this is what I wanted us to talk about, especially at the backdrop of South African President Cyril Ramaphosa's call yesterday at the UN General Assembly for the sanctions against Zimbabwe to be lifted. And he stated in that address that the sanctions are hurting the people of Zimbabwe. Not only that, he also added that Zimbabweans, because they are suffering, have become a burden. Not in those words, but he said Zimbabwe's neighbors are bearing the brunt of these sanctions hurting the ordinary Zimbabweans. Then there are others who are arguing, including journalists in Zimbabwe, that no. The sanctions are not the main cause of Zimbabweans suffering. They are saying that the sanctions actually are targeting a select few based on their human rights record. So this is what I want us to talk about today. And I'm gonna be very blunt. I'm gonna refer also to those so-called sanctions that are there in Zimbabwe. First and foremost, was Ramaphosa right to call for the sanctions against Zimbabwe? You will make that decision after I've spoken about this, but I will also want us to engage on this. You are free to use the chat box. It's on your right, on the right of your computer, to send through some questions, to send through your own ideas around this. So this is what we want us to engage. Somebody has already sent, someone is already aggressive. I don't know why Zimbabweans are so emotional when it comes to issues of politics, as if somebody has been, let me leave it like that. Let me just continue with what I said. I wanted us to talk about. So the issue here about the sanctions is that there is a document that was written in 2001, which became the basis on which everything else that followed in the name of economic measures against Zimbabwe was built. So the document was written and passed by the US Congress. It's called the Zimbabwe Economic It's called the ZIDERA in brief, the Zimbabwe Economic Recovery Act. So it was passed into law on December 21, 2001 by the United States Congress. This is the basis on which the sanctions on Zimbabwe, they remain, the subsequent other measures against Zimbabwe were then built. So it was Public Law 107, passed by the US Congress. It's called the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001. In short, ZIDERA, it's a 4-page, let me say 3.5-page document speaking to the sanctions. Now, I will read through some of the sections and you will determine for yourself if this is targeting individuals or it is targeting the people or the government of Zimbabwe or the people of Zimbabwe. Section 1, the short title, this act may be cited as the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001. In short, that is ZIDERA. Statement of policy. It is the policy of the United States to support the people of Zimbabwe in their struggle to effect peaceful, democratic change, achieve broad-based and equitable economic growth, and restore the rule of law. Section 3, which deals with definitions, I'm going to skip that. Okay, let me read it. In this act, 1, international financial institutions. The term international financial institutions means the multilateral development banks and the International Monetary Fund, which we know as the IMF. Number 2, multilateral development banks. The term means the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Development Association, the International Finance Corporation, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Investment Corporation, the African Development Bank, the African Development Fund, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. So these are the banks that are bracketed under the Multilateral Development Banks under this Act. Section 4, support for democratic transition and economic recovery. Subsection A says, findings. Congress makes the following findings. Number 1, through economic mismanagement, undemocratic practices, and the costly deployment of troops to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the government of Zimbabwe has rendered itself ineligible to participate in International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and International Monetary Fund programs, which would otherwise be providing substantial resources to assist in the recovery and modernization of Zimbabwe's economy. The people of Zimbabwe have thus been denied the economic and democratic benefits envisioned by the donors to such programs, including the United States. Number 2, in September 1999, the IMF suspended its support under a standby arrangement approved the previous month for economic adjustment and reform in Zimbabwe. Number 3, in October 1999, the International Development Association, in this section referred to as the IDA, suspended all structural adjustment loans, credits, and guarantees to the government of Zimbabwe. Number 4, in May 2000, the IDA suspended all other new lending to the government of Zimbabwe. I want us to emphasize that because that is where the contention is. Number 5, rather. In September 2000, the IDA suspended disbursement of funds for ongoing projects under development, under previously approved loans, credits, and guarantees to the government of Zimbabwe. And subsection B of number 5, the subsection B, that was subsection A. Support for democratic transition and economic recovery. Number 1, bilateral debt relief. Upon receipt by the appropriate congressional committees of a certification described in subsection D, the Secretary of the Treasury shall undertake a review of the feasibility of restructuring, rescheduling, or eliminating the sovereign debt of Zimbabwe held by any agency of the United States government. Number 2, multilateral debt relief and other financial assistance. It is the sense of Congress that upon receipt by the appropriate congressional committees of a certification described in subsection D, the Secretary of the Treasury should A, direct the United States Executive Director of each multilateral development bank to propose that the bank should undertake a review of the feasibility of restructuring, rescheduling, or eliminating the sovereign debt of Zimbabwe held by that bank, and B, direct the United States Executive Director of each international financial institution to which the United States is a member to propose to undertake financial and technical support for Zimbabwe, especially support that is intended to promote Zimbabwe's economic recovery and development, the stabilization of the Zimbabwean dollar, and the viability of Zimbabwe's democratic institutions. C, multilateral financing restriction. Until the President makes the certification described in subsection D, and except as may be required to meet basic human needs or for good governance, the Secretary of the Treasury shall instruct the United States Executive Director to each international financial institution to oppose and vote against, number 1, any extension by the respective institution of any loan, credit, or guarantee to the government of Zimbabwe, or number 2, any cancellation or reduction of indebtedness owed by the government of Zimbabwe to the United States or any international financial institution. D, presidential certification that certain conditions are satisfied. A certification under the subsection is certification transmitted to the appropriate congressional committees of a determination made by the president that the following conditions are satisfied. Number 1, restoration of the rule of law. Number 2, election or pre-election conditions. Either of the following 2 conditions is satisfied. Presidential election, that is A. B, pre-election conditions. Number 3, commitment to equitable, legal, and transparent land reform. Number 4, fulfillment of agreement ending war in Democratic Republic of Congo. Number 5, military and national police subordinate to civilian government. Now, and then E of number 4, waiver. That is subsection E now. Waiver. The president may waive the provisions of subsection B, subsection 1, or subsection C if the president determines that it is in the national interest of the United States to do so. Subsection 5, support for democratic institutions, the free press and independent media, and the rule of law. In general, the president is authorized to provide assistance under Part 1 and Chapter 4 of Part 2 of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 to, number 1, support an independent and free press and electronic media in Zimbabwe. Number 2, support equitable, legal, and transparent mechanisms of land reform in Zimbabwe, including the payment of costs related to the acquisition of land and the resettlement of individuals, consistent with the International Donors Conference on Land Reform and Resettlement in Zimbabwe held in Harare, Zimbabwe in September 1998, or any subsequent agreement relating thereto. And 3, provide for democracy and governance programs in Zimbabwe. B, funding of the funds authorized to be appropriated to carry out part 1 and chapter 4 of part 2 of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 for fiscal year 2002. Then they mention the money that they approved for those. Now, the last part, supersedes other laws. The authority in this section supersedes any other provision of law. Sense of Congress on the actions to be taken against individuals responsible for violence and the breakdown of the rule of law. So now, this is the section which deals supposedly with individuals. It is the sense of Congress that the president should begin immediate consultation with the governments of the European Union, member states, Canada, and other appropriate foreign countries on ways in which to, number 1, identify and share information regarding individuals responsible for the deliberate breakdown of the rule of law, politically motivated violence, and intimidation in Zimbabwe. Number 2, identify assets of those individuals held outside Zimbabwe. Number 3, implement travel and economic sanctions against those individuals and their associates and families. And number 4, provide for the eventual removal or amendment of those sanctions approved December 21, 2001. So this is ZIDERA. And what should be noted is that it has been amended every now and then. And now those countries that I mentioned, which were going to be consulted, include Australia, which have also come up with these so-called travel restrictions against certain individuals. But we have to note that ZIDERA doesn't mention any individual. It's specifically about the government of Zimbabwe. So when people say there are sanctions against Zimbabwe, they are right. There are sanctions against Zimbabwe, as I've already read out in the ZIDERA. What necessitated these sanctions is the actions of the Zimbabwean government. That one we cannot run away from. We cannot run away from the fact that there are sanctions against Zimbabwe. We can also, if we were to be genuine with each other, not run away from the fact that ZANU-PF contributed to these sanctions being put in place. Do the sanctions hurt Zimbabwe as a country, the Zimbabwean economy? They do. The collapse of Zimbabwean parastatals, other than from mismanagement, is also attributable to the sanctions. And many of you will note that after the imposition of sanctions, things went haywire in Zimbabwe, especially economically. But that's not solely because of sanctions, because there are some who have come up with a counter argument that no, it's not the sanctions, it's the looting. My genuine answer is that it's both. It's both. There has been a lot of looting, uncontrolled looting, which has been present. There's been a lot of mismanagement. There's been a lot of economic crimes that have been committed in Zimbabwe. And those who have been committing these crimes have been doing so with impunity. None has been punished for those. But we cannot, if we as Zimbabweans choose one devil over the other, both of these things are affecting the people of Zimbabwe. The looting is affecting the people of Zimbabwe. The sanctions are also affecting the people of Zimbabwe. And any Zimbabwean who is genuine with themselves, any Zimbabwean who is patriotic with their country, would want to see both ZANU-PF, which is causing the looting, and the sanctions going, because there is none of the two which is better than the other. Both are bad, and we cannot therefore be seen taking sides with either ZANU-PF's actions or the sanctions, because both are working against us. And the other thing is, these sanctions are giving ZANU-PF the leeway to continue looting, to continue squandering, to continue misgoverning, and then hiding behind sanctions that we cannot perform because there are sanctions. So if we are of the belief that these sanctions are not the ones that are causing the suffering of Zimbabwe, then why do we fight everyone who says these sanctions must be removed? Because if they are not the ones that are causing the suffering of Zimbabweans, that if they're not the ones that are causing the economic downturn of Zimbabwe, then why do we fight so heavily to see them maintained? Because it means that they're sterile. Then remove them and then see if Zimbabwe is going to recover. But there are people who are benefiting from either. And ZANU-PF is benefiting from this because they have a leeway now to say we are failing to govern because there are sanctions imposed on the country. And they've rallied the African Union countries. Today, just a few hours ago, less than an hour ago, the Namibian president was saying that sanctions against Zimbabwe must be removed because they've been convinced that Zimbabwe is in its current state because there are sanctions imposed by the West on Zimbabwe. So let us have these sanctions removed and see what happens. Because at the end of the day, these people that are governing Zimbabwe are not suffering the cause of the sanctions because they are looting the country. They are continuing to loot, and they will continue to loot and hide behind sanctions. But if there are no more sanctions, what are they going to say? They won't have this leeway. But the reason why certain people are fighting so hard whenever sanctions are mentioned to say, no, these are targeted measures, no, they are not the problem is looting, is because either they are paid propagandists for the West or they are benefiting from the situation on the ground alongside their ZANU-PF counterparts, because the people who are benefiting here are those that are standing for sanctions, those that are doing propaganda for the Western sanctions, and those that are blaming the sanctions for the looting that they are doing. So every genuine Zimbabwean who is not benefiting from this would want to see this obstacle or this leeway that ZANU-PF has being removed so that ZANU-PF is exposed. We need to expose them for the failures without them having a shield to hide behind. But because there are people who know that these sanctions are hurting the people, they would rather defend these sanctions. Whenever the sanctions are mentioned, they'll bring the shield of, no, it's not the sanctions, it's the looting. Because to them, the sanctions must continue to be there, and the people of Zimbabwe must continue to suffer so that they can hopefully remove ZANU-PF. And we have had these sanctions for more than 22 years. They're not working. Because if, as people say, that they are not the cause of this economic rot, then why are they being maintained? It means they're not working. Why are they being maintained there? Other than that, they are being used as a ZANU-PF shield. So there is something sinister about this. Zimbabweans are being taken for a ride. Zimbabweans are being used as guinea, as guinea pigs in this whole thing, in a political game from which only those that are fighting ZANU-PF and ZANU-PF itself are benefiting. Then the other issue is, for those that are saying these are targeted measures, I've read ZIDERA out. There's no person who is mentioned there other than at the end. The rest is about the government of Zimbabwe. It's about Zimbabwean government officials. And then the other thing is these so-called people that have been placed under travel restrictions or under targeted sanctions, as soon as they are out of government, because they are saying that they are put there for their human rights abuses. And the belief is, if you have committed human rights abuses, you will remain guilty, you remain a suspect until you have been cleared by a court. But here in these sanctions, in this ZIDERA thing, or these so-called targeted measures by the rest of the West, which include Australia, Britain, and others, you will find that if as soon as somebody has left government, or as soon as somebody has left ZANU-PF, without paying for the political violence that they've been accused of, without paying for the human rights abuses that they partook in, they are automatically removed from the sanctions, and then they continue with their life. There are a number of them, the likes of Joyce Mujuru, the likes of the late Dumiso Tabengwa, the rest of them were all removed from these sanctions without them having paid for their sins. So this shows as well that There's a lot of games being played here, and what we should not do is to fall for the propaganda of either ZANU-PF or the mainstream opposition and those journalists who are on the payroll of either. Because at the end of the day, the people are being used as guinea pigs. The people are being used as a playground. They continue to suffer while the person who's looting from them is being given a leeway, and the person who wants to replace the person who is looting also has a weapon that is using against the people. So the issue is both the sanctions and the looting of resources are bad for Zimbabwe. Let's stop supporting or defending either. Let's stop falling for the propaganda. ZIDERA is there. It's publicly available. Just Google ZIDERA with all its amendments, and you will see that the lie that these are targeted sanctions, blah, 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 is just an empty lie which takes advantage of people who don't want to read. Then there is a few comments. Sanctions, Wombe, Izan, we don't care your bluntness. No. There is nothing called sanctions, Wombe. Both these things, you are personally being affected by this. Put it all on the top steps of ZANU-PF, the devil that created sanctions is there. This is where the problem is. You are taking sides with either of the devils that are affecting you. Don't be used for political gains, because the person who is going to suffer most is you. ZANU-PF is not suffering. With or without sanctions, they will continue rigging elections, they will continue looting, and they will blame it on the sanctions. So unless you support ZANU-PF and you want them to continue in charge of the economy, and you want them to continue looting and having a scapegoat, you will support the sanctions. If you are not one of those who want to see ZANU-PF scapegoating the sanctions, you will fight for their removal so that ZANU-PF is exposed. Or you could be one of those who know that the sanctions are indeed hurting the people of Zimbabwe, and you want them to continue in place so that you hopefully get your will of having the people of Zimbabwe rise up against ZANU-PF. But this has failed. Admit that these sanctions have failed, and we need to look at something else. Thank you very much. This is what I had for you today. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it. Bye.